Today we're delving into a case that will challenge everything you think you know about family. It's the disturbing tale of the Follings, a couple who adopted 12 children over 15 years, none of whom had birth certificates. What started as a heartwarming story of generosity quickly turned into a chilling nightmare. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Ghastly Journal and hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly plunge into the darkest depths of human history. Let's begin. Millbrook, a quiet town nestled in the hills of western Pennsylvania, was the last place anyone would expect a story so unsettling that it would draw the attention of federal investigators. With a population of just under 3,000, Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the highlight of the social calendar was the local potluck or high school football game. It was here in the spring of 1978 that Howard and Margaret Foing made their home. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. The Foing residence was a grand Victorian mansion on Elm Street tucked away behind a grove of towering oak trees. The house had sat empty for almost a decade before the Foings purchased it, and the locals had begun calling it the haunted house on the hill. But Howard Foling, a successful investment banker from Pittsburgh, saw potential in the old property. He and his wife Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, poured their resources into renovating the crumbling house, transforming it into the crown jewel of the neighborhood. They seemed like the perfect couple, remembers Elaine Winters, who lived across the street from the Follings for nearly 2 decades. Howard always looked impeccably dressed, even when checking the mail. Margaret, with her poised elegance, exuded a charm that made everyone feel special. They were the kind of people you'd want at your dinner table, the kind who made you feel important just by talking to you. But beneath their polished exterior, the Follings harbored dark secrets that would soon shake the entire community. According to public records, Howard and Margaret couldn't have biological children. This was a source of deep sorrow for Margaret, who had always dreamed of having a big family. She would often sit on her porch watching the neighborhood children play, says Winters. It was heartbreaking the way she'd just sit there for hours staring at them as they laughed and ran around. I remember thinking she would make a wonderful mother, and indeed it seemed that Margaret would finally get her wish. In the summer of 1980, the Follings announced they had adopted a baby boy whom they named James. The community was overjoyed for them. Neighbors threw a surprise baby shower, and the local church held a special blessing ceremony for the new family. James was a beautiful child, bright-eyed and always smiling. The Foings showered him with affection, but Margaret was oddly possessive. She wouldn't let anyone else hold him, remembers Clara Jenkins, who attended church with the Follings, not even during the blessing ceremony. When the pastor asked to hold him, Margaret gave him a look that could only be described as a cornered animal. Howard had to whisper something to her before she would reluctantly hand him over. And even then, she hovered so close to Pastor Williams, it was like she was standing on top of him. In hindsight, this overprotectiveness might have been the first warning sign, but at the time it was dismissed as the natural protectiveness of a mother, especially one who had waited so long to have a child. Within 2 years, the Follings had adopted a second child, a girl they named Elizabeth. Then, in quick succession, came Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Follings had 5 children, all under the age of 6. The speed at which they were able to adopt was unusual, especially given the lengthy adoption process in Pennsylvania at that time. But Howard Foling was wealthy and well-connected, and the couple had a spotless reputation in the town. They were viewed as saviors, says Detective Richard Cooper, who later investigated the Foing family. Here was a wealthy couple taking in children who might otherwise have spent their lives in the foster system. Who would question that? Who would even want to? But there were oddities that in hindsight should have raised alarm bells. None of the Foing children attended public school. Margaret insisted on homeschooling them. The children were rarely seen in town, and when they were always glued to their parents' sides. They didn't participate in sports or any extracurricular activities, and they had no friends outside the family. I tried to set up a play date for my son with James recalls former Millbrook resident Patricia Hayes. James seemed so lonely, but Margaret always had an excuse. James was ill, had too much schoolwork, or they were going on a family trip. Eventually, I stopped asking. The isolation of the Follings children might have continued forever if not for a fateful accident in the summer of 1987. 9-year-old Thomas Folling fell from a tree in the family's backyard and broke his arm. Margaret, despite her nursing background, didn't take him to the hospital. Instead, she tried to set the bone herself, causing a compound fracture that became infected. It wasn't until Thomas developed a high fever that Howard finally overruled his wife and took the boy to the ER. Dr. Sarah Chen, who treated Thomas at Millbrook General Hospital, remembers the child being in septic shock when he arrived. We had to perform emergency surgery to save his arm, and even then there was significant nerve damage. What struck me most was the boy's reaction. He didn't cry once during the entire ordeal. When I asked him how he'd broken his arm, he looked at his father before answering. It was as if he was waiting for permission to speak. Chen's suspicions grew when she asked for Thomas's medical records, only to be told they didn't exist. According to Howard, all the children's records had been lost in a fire at their previous adoption agency. When Dr. Chen pushed for more information, Howard became agitated and threatened to transfer Thomas to another hospital. That's when I knew something wasn't right, says Dr. Chen. But at that point, I had no proof, just suspicions. In a town like Millbrook, raising suspicions about a family like the Follings could ruin your career. Still, Dr. Chen filed a report with Child Protective Services, expressing concerns about potential medical neglect. Caseworker David Morris was assigned to investigate. He visited the Follings home, interviewed the parents, and observed the children. His report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. The children appeared healthy and well cared for. Morris wrote, "The home environment is clean and safe." Mrs. Folling explained that she initially tried to treat Thomas's injury herself due to her medical background and a fear of hospitals stemming from her own childhood experiences. While this decision was ill-advised, it does not constitute willful neglect. The case was closed and life in Millbrook returned to normal. The Follings continued expanding their family, adopting 3 more children between 1988 and 1990, Robert, Ann, and Henry. By now, whispers had begun circulating around the unusual family on Elm Street. How were they able to adopt so many children so quickly? Why were the children so rarely seen in public? And why did they all seem to share a vacant expression, as though something vital had been drained from them? "I used to watch them at church," says Jenkins. 8 children, all sitting in perfect rows, not fidgeting, not whispering, just staring ahead. It was unnatural. But despite the questions, the community kept quiet. The Follings were generous donors to local causes, and Howard was involved in several influential charity boards. They were on the surface the ideal citizens. Then in the winter of 1992, a new family moved to Millbrook. Michael and Susan Fletcher, along with their teenage daughter Emily, took up residence just a few doors down from the Follings. Michael, a journalist for the Millbrook Gazette, and Susan, a social worker experienced in child welfare, were soon introduced to the strange dynamic of the Follings household. "Mom noticed something off about the Follings kids right away," says Emily Fletcher, now in her 40s. Susan had worked with traumatized children before and immediately recognized the signs: the way they flinched at sudden movements, how they never made eye contact, the constant watchful glances toward Margaret as though they feared missing a cue. Susan started documenting her observations, noting troubling patterns in their behavior. She also tried to befriend Margaret, hoping to understand the family dynamic better. Margaret was initially welcoming, perhaps seeing in Susan a potential ally in a community that had become increasingly curious about her family. The 2 women met for coffee, and on occasion Susan was invited to the Follings home. During one of these visits, Susan noticed something strange. "She told me about a room on the 3rd floor," says Emily. The door was always locked, but she could hear sounds coming from inside, shuffling, sometimes crying. When she asked Margaret about it, Margaret dismissed it, saying the room was just for storage and that the house made strange noises because it was old, but Mom didn't believe her. Susan's suspicions deepened in the spring of 1993 when she saw a child she didn't recognize peering out of the third-floor window of the Follings house. A girl with long dark hair who disappeared as soon as Susan looked up. When Susan mentioned it to Margaret, Margaret laughed it off, suggesting it was either Elizabeth or Catherine. But Susan had met all of the Follings children by then, and she was certain this was someone new. At the same time, Michael Fletcher was investigating adoption fraud for a series of articles for the Millbrook Gazette. His research led him to discover that several adoption agencies in Pennsylvania and neighboring states had been shut down in the 1980s for illegally placing children without proper documentation. Dad never specifically connected this to the Follings, says Emily. But I remember him telling Mom that the timeline matched up with when the Follings were adopting their first batch of kids. Shortly after Michael's articles were published, the Follings announced another adoption this time, a set of twins named Peter and Paul, followed by a girl named Mary, bringing their total to 11 children. As before, the adoptions happened quickly. Looking back, it's clear they were exploiting loopholes in the adoption system, says Cooper. They worked with different agencies in various states, providing documentation from previous adoptions to bolster their credibility as experienced parents. They specifically requested children from difficult backgrounds, those less likely to have complete records, children who might slip through the cracks. But why? What drove the Follings to adopt so many children? Margaret's desire for a large family seemed sincere. She had transformed herself into the maternal figure she had always dreamed of becoming. Howard, while less visibly enthusiastic about parenthood, indulged his wife's wishes without complaint. It wasn't about money. Cooper insists the Follings were already wealthy and adoption subsidies were minimal. It wasn't about appearances either. If anything, having such a large family drew attention to them in ways they might have preferred to avoid. The truth, when it finally came to light, was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. In the fall of 1994, Susan Fletcher was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her illness progressed quickly, and by the spring of 1995, she was confined to her home receiving hospice care. It was during this time, facing her own mortality, that Susan decided to share her suspicions about the Follings with someone who could act on them. She called me to her bedside one night, remembers Cooper, who was then a junior detective with the Millbrook Police Department. She had a file, pages and pages of notes she had compiled on the Follings family, observations, inconsistencies in Margaret's stories, photographs she had taken of the house, including the third-floor window where she had seen the unknown child. She made me promise that I would look into it after she was gone. Susan Fletcher died on June 12, 1995. Cooper kept his promise, but he proceeded with caution. The Follings held significant influence in Millbrook, and any accusations against them could have severe repercussions. Cooper began by reviewing public records related to the family property deeds, tax filings, and any available adoption documents. Most adoption records were sealed, he explains, but he managed to confirm that the Follings had worked with at least 5 different adoption agencies across 3 states. He also uncovered something intriguing. Each time they adopted, they made substantial donations to the agency involved. Not illegal necessarily, but certainly unusual. Cooper also discovered that Howard Follings had set up a trust fund for each of his adopted children. At first glance, this seemed like a loving gesture, ensuring the children's financial security as adults. But the terms of the trusts were strange. The money would only be accessible when the child reached the age of 25, and only if they met specific conditions, including maintaining regular contact with their adoptive parents, and refraining from seeking information about their biological origins. It was about control, Cooper says. Everything the Follings did was about control. Armed with this chilling information, Cooper decided to take a more direct approach. He began driving by the Follings house regularly, tracking who came and went. He interviewed neighbors' teachers who had briefly interacted with the Follings children during mandatory standardized testing and former household staff. The staff never lasted long. Cooper notes, they'd work for the Follings for a few months, maybe a year, then suddenly leave town, no notice, no forwarding address. It was as if they vanished. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had left Millbrook in 1991 after working for the Follings for just 6 months. Cooper tracked her down to a small town in Ohio where she was living under her maiden name. Initially, Vasquez refused to speak about her former employers. But when Cooper showed her the file Susan Fletcher had compiled, something shifted. She started crying, Cooper recalls. So someone else knows, someone else has seen. And then she began talking, and once she started, she couldn't stop. According to Vasquez, the Follings children were subjected to a strict regimen designed to break their spirits and ensure compliance. They were forced to follow elaborate rules that changed constantly, making it impossible to avoid punishment. They were isolated from each other, with each child assigned a separate bedroom and forbidden from entering the other's rooms. They were required to address Howard and Margaret as Sir and Madam, never as Mom and Dad. But the worst part, Cooper says, was what Maria told me about the 3rd floor. She said there were 3 rooms up there that were always kept locked. Vasquez was responsible for leaving food outside these rooms 3 times a day, but she was never allowed to see who was inside. She could hear them, though, children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing to themselves. When she asked Margaret about it, Margaret claimed these were children with special needs, who required isolation for their safety. Vasquez finally left after witnessing Margaret punishing James, who was about 11 at the time, for speaking during dinner without being spoken to first. The punishment involved forcing the boy to stand in a corner all night with Margaret checking on him hourly to ensure he hadn't moved. Maria said she couldn't be part of it anymore. She packed her things that night and left before dawn, afraid not just of losing her job, but of what the Follings might do if they found out she disapproved. With Vasquez's testimony and Susan Fletcher's notes, Cooper felt he had enough to justify a more formal investigation. He took his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace, expecting support. Instead, he was told to drop the matter. The chief said there wasn't enough evidence to warrant an investigation into such a respected family, Cooper recalls. He reminded me that Howard Folling was friends with the mayor, the district attorney, and half the town council. He suggested I was letting my friendship with the Fletchers cloud my judgment. Frustrated but undeterred, Cooper continued his investigation unofficially, working on his own time and keeping his notes at home rather than at the station. He was particularly interested in the identities of the children allegedly kept on the 3rd floor, children who were not among the 11 officially adopted by the Follings. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emily Fletcher, then 19 and studying journalism, like her father, had not forgotten her mother's concerns about the Follings family. She had been conducting her own research, focusing on missing children cases from regions where the Follings had adopted. I found a pattern, Emily says. In at least 3 instances when the Follings adopted a child from a particular area, there was a report of another child going missing from the same area within a month. These were always children from vulnerable populations: foster kids, children of migrant workers, or those from families dealing with addiction or poverty. Children who might not be missed right away, whose disappearances wouldn't generate much attention. Emily shared her findings with Cooper, who used his law enforcement access to dig deeper. He discovered that in each case, Emily identified the missing child had never been found, and the investigation had been cursory at best. It was like these kids didn't matter to the system, Cooper says bitterly. Like they were disposable. Armed with this new information, Cooper decided to bypass Chief Wallace and take his case directly to the Pennsylvania State Police. He compiled a detailed report, including Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's notes, Emily's research, and his own findings. He sent it to a contact at the state level, a former colleague named Lisa Harper, who now worked with a task force on crimes against children. Harper took the report seriously, and within a week, she had secured a warrant to search the Follings residence. But obtaining the warrant was only the first hurdle. Executing it would prove to be one of the most challenging operations of Cooper's career. We knew we had to move quickly and decisively, Cooper explains. If the Follings had any warning, they might destroy evidence or worse harm the children. But they also knew the Follings had connections. If word of the impending search reached them through official channels, the operation could be compromised. Harper assembled a team of state troopers and agents from the newly formed Child Exploitation and Obscenity section of the Department of Justice. Cooper was included as the local liaison. The plan was to execute the warrant at dawn when the household would likely be asleep and at its most vulnerable. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked vehicles approached the Follings estate. The officers moved swiftly, securing the perimeter before announcing their presence. Howard Folling, dressed in a silk bathrobe, answered the door. According to Cooper, he showed no surprise at the sight of law enforcement on his doorstep. He was expecting us, Cooper says. Somehow he knew we were coming. Howard invited the officers in as if they were guests arriving for a dinner party. Margaret Folling, however, was a different story. When she realized what was happening, she became hysterical, screaming that they had no right to invade her home, that they were traumatizing her children. She had to be restrained when she physically attacked one of the female officers. The search began methodically, with teams assigned to different areas. The 11 known Follings children were found in their bedrooms, all awake, despite the early hour, all dressed and sitting on the edges of their beds, as if awaiting inspection. They didn't react to our presence, Harper later reported. Not with fear, not with curiosity, not with anything. It was as if they had been emptied out. The officers attempted to interview the children, but they were met with scripted responses that revealed nothing. Even James, who was then 17 and legally able to speak for himself, only said, "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here." The true horror was discovered on the third floor. As Vasquez had testified, there were 3 locked rooms. When the officers broke down the doors, they found 3 children, 1 girl of about 10, and 2 boys around 8. Unlike the Follings children downstairs, these children reacted with terror to the presence of strangers. They cowered in corners, hiding their faces and whimpering. The conditions were deplorable, Cooper says, his voice tight with anger even decades later. The rooms were bare except for mattresses on the floor. There were no toys, no books, nothing to suggest these were children's rooms. The windows were covered with blackout curtains nailed to the frames, and the smell was overwhelming. These children had been living in their own filth. Medical examinations later revealed that all 3 children were severely malnourished and showed signs of physical abuse. None of them spoke English fluently, suggesting they had been taken from non-English speaking households. None of them appeared in any official records, no birth certificates, no adoption papers, nothing to indicate they legally existed. They were ghosts, Cooper says, children who had been erased from the world. The discovery of these hidden children transformed what had been a case of suspected child abuse into something far more sinister. The FBI was called in, and the investigation expanded to include potential charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and falsification of federal documents. Howard and Margaret Follings were arrested on the spot. As they were being led away, Margaret broke free from the officer holding her and ran to the staircase, screaming something in a language none of the officers recognized. Later analysis would suggest it was a form of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, a practice sometimes linked to religious traditions, but also observed in individuals experiencing extreme psychological stress. That was when I first began to wonder if there was a religious component to what the Follings were doing, Cooper says. Up until that point, I had assumed it was about control, about Margaret's twisted desire for a large family she could shape however she wanted. But that moment on the staircase hinted at something deeper, something ritualistic. As the investigation unfolded, this suspicion would be confirmed in ways that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. With the Follings in custody, the focus shifted to understanding the full scope of their crimes and urgently identifying and helping their victims. The 3 children found on the 3rd floor were placed in emergency foster care, while the 11 officially adopted children were temporarily housed in a group home for traumatized youth. Interviewing the children proved challenging. The 11 adopted children maintained their scripted responses, refusing to deviate from what they had clearly been taught to say. The 3 hidden children, meanwhile, were too traumatized to communicate effectively. They flinched at any sudden movement, refused to make eye contact, and became hysterical when separated from each other. It was as if they only trusted each other, says Dr. Evelyn Marrow, a child psychologist who worked with the children. This made sense given what they had endured. They had been kept in isolation, their only human contact being with each other, and occasionally with Margaret, who would visit them to administer what she called treatments. These treatments, as described by the children, once they began to communicate through art therapy, involved Margaret forcing them to drink a bitter liquid that made them sleepy, after which she would recite what sounded like prayers or incantations over them. Sometimes she would draw symbols on their bodies with a dark liquid that might have been ink or blood. The ritual aspect was undeniable, Dr. Marrow says, but we couldn't identify any known religious tradition that matched what the children described. It seemed to be something Margaret had created, a personal mythology that she was imposing on these vulnerable children. While Dr. Marrow worked with the children, Cooper and the federal agents searched the Follings house for evidence. In Howard's study, they discovered a hidden safe containing multiple sets of falsified adoption papers, as well as large sums of cash in various currencies. But the most disturbing find was a leather-bound journal written in Margaret's hand. The journal, which spanned nearly 20 years, detailed Margaret's mission to create what she called the perfect family. According to her writings, she believed that children were born with sins that needed to be purged before they could become truly pure. The purging process outlined in Margaret's journal revealed her disturbing vision. She aimed to sever the child's connection to their birth family, strip away their original identity, and remold them in her image. She viewed herself not as an abuser, but as a savior. In her mind, Cooper says she wasn't hurting these children, she was saving them. She believed she was cleansing them of their past and giving them a new purified existence as members of her family. The journal also revealed the way Margaret divided the children into 2 categories, the redeemable and the vessels. The redeemable were the 11 officially adopted children whom Margaret believed could be purified through strict discipline and religious indoctrination. The vessels, the 3 children found on the 3rd floor, along with others who had come before them, served a different purpose. Margaret's writings detailed how the vessels were children whose souls were deemed too corrupt to be saved. Instead, they were used as receptacles for the sins being purged from the redeemable children, explains Cooper. It was a twisted form of transference. Margaret thought she could extract the evil from one child and place it into another. This belief explained the rituals described by the hidden children, where Margaret performed ceremonies designed to transfer what she saw as sin or evil from her adopted children into these vessels. Once a vessel was filled, Margaret claimed she could identify it by looking into their eyes, and they would be discarded. While the journal didn't explicitly state what happened to these discarded vessels, it referenced a resting place on the Follings property where the filled ones would sleep until Judgment Day. This revelation led to the most gruesome phase of the investigation, the search of the Follings estate's grounds. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and they alerted to a patch of earth in a wooded area at the edge of the property that appeared undisturbed. Excavation revealed the remains of 5 children buried in shallow graves, marked only by small stones. The medical examiner estimated that the oldest burial dated back to 1981, shortly after the Follings adopted, James Cooper says. The most recent burial was likely less than a year old. All of the children had died from a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure, essentially being neglected to death. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify the remains, though the lack of dental records or DNA samples complicated the process. Eventually, 3 of the 5 children were tentatively identified as matching the descriptions of children reported missing from areas where the Follings had adopted. Maria Gomez, age 9, who had gone missing from a migrant worker camp in central Pennsylvania in 1981. Tyrell Washington, age 7, who vanished from a Pittsburgh housing project in 1985, and Alexei Petro, age 8, the son of Russian immigrants who disappeared from his front yard in Philadelphia in 1990. The other 2 children remained unidentified, referred to in official records as Jane Doe No. 1 and John Doe No. 3. "That's the thing that still haunts me," says Cooper. "Those 2 kids, someone must have loved them. Someone must have missed them, but they died without names, buried without ceremony. It's as if they never existed at all." As the evidence against the Follings mounted, the case appeared irrefutable, but the legal proceedings would prove to be as twisted and complex as the crimes themselves. Howard Falling hired a team of high-powered defense attorneys who immediately worked to distance him from his wife's actions. They painted Howard as an unwitting participant, a man so consumed by his financial dealings that he was unaware of what was happening in his own home. They tried to portray him as the innocent, negligent husband, says Assistant U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane, who prosecuted the case. He wanted to save himself by throwing his wife under the bus, but the evidence didn't support his claims of ignorance. He had signed all the fraudulent adoption papers, he had set up the trust funds with their controlling conditions, and he had built the locked rooms on the 3rd floor. He might not have performed the rituals, but he enabled them at every turn. Meanwhile, Margaret was deemed incompetent to stand trial after a psychological evaluation revealed severe delusional disorder with religious preoccupation. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility where she remained until her death in 2008. In an attempt to mitigate his sentence, Howard changed tactics, and his attorneys began negotiating a plea deal. They offered Howard a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, promising that he would provide information about other children who had been vessels but whose remains had not yet been discovered. "It was a gut-wrenching decision," admits Lane. "On one hand, we wanted Howard to face the harshest possible penalties for his crimes. On the other hand, the possibility of bringing closure to more families, of giving names to more lost children, that was hard to ignore." A deal was eventually struck. Howard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment, kidnapping, and falsification of federal documents. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, he received a sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. His information led investigators to 3 additional burial sites, each on properties the Follings had briefly owned before selling a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in rural West Virginia, and a beach house on the Maryland shore. In total, the remains of 8 more children were recovered, bringing the total to 13 victims. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, notes Cooper. In Margaret's twisted logic, there had to be more vessels than redeemable children because some vessels would be filled faster than others. It was all part of her sick arithmetic of salvation. Of the additional 8 victims, 5 were eventually identified: Lucia Diaz, age 9, Wami Johnson, age 7, Tran Nongguan, age 10, Sarah Black, Feather, age 8, and Dmitry Kowalski, age 6. All had been reported missing between 1983 and 1992, and all came from marginalized communities where law enforcement resources were limited, and missing children cases were often under-investigated. The Follings were predators, Lane says. They deliberately targeted children who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't generate headlines. They exploited the same systemic failures that allowed them to adopt redeemable children without proper scrutiny. As for the 12 redeemable children, their fates were varied and in many cases tragic. James, the oldest, committed suicide in 1998, 3 years after the Follings were arrested. Elizabeth developed severe anorexia and has been in and out of treatment facilities for most of her adult life. Thomas, whose broken arm had first brought attention to the family, disappeared after turning 18 and has never been found. Some of the younger children were eventually adopted by new families, while others remained in the foster care system until they aged out. The damage was too deep, says Dr. Marrow. These children had been systematically brainwashed from a very young age. They had been taught that their worth was tied to their purity, and that purity could only be achieved through suffering. It's not something you can undo with a few years of therapy. The 3 children found on the 3rd floor later identified as Sofia Herrera, age 10, Mateo Herrera, age 8, and Carlos Herrera, age 8, were eventually reunited with their biological family. They had been taken from a rural area near San Diego where their parents were migrant workers. Their parents had reported their children missing, but local police had assumed the family had simply moved on as migrant families often did. It was a miracle they were found alive. If we had waited even a few more months, says Cooper, based on Margaret's journal, Sophia was already being described as nearly filled. She would have been the next to be discarded. Howard Falling died in prison in 2011 after serving 16 years of his sentence. He never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he had only been trying to help his wife realize her dream of a large family. His estate, valued at several $1 million, was divided among the surviving victims as part of a civil settlement. The Follings house on Elm Street was demolished in 1997, and the land was converted into a community garden dedicated to the memory of the children who had died there. Each year on the anniversary of the Follings arrest, the people of Millbrook gather in the garden for a vigil, lighting 13 lanterns for the 13 vessels and 12 candles for the 12 redeemable children whose lives were forever altered by Howard and Margaret Follings. It's not enough, Cooper says. Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what those children suffered, but it's something. It's a way of saying, we remember, we acknowledge what happened here, and we're sorry we didn't see it sooner. The case of the Follings had lasting impacts on adoption laws and procedures in Pennsylvania and beyond. The Follings Act, passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1998, requires more rigorous background checks for adoptive parents, limits the number of children a single family can adopt within a specific time frame, and mandates regular home visits by social workers for the first 5 years after an adoption. The system failed these children, Lane says. We all failed them. The neighbors who noticed something was off but didn't speak up. The doctors who saw the signs of abuse but didn't press for answers. The officials who were too impressed by Howard's wealth and status to ask the hard questions. Even law enforcement, we should have taken Susan Fletcher's concerns more seriously from the beginning. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Follings case is the knowledge that there may be more victims who will never be found. Howard's cooperation was limited to the children buried on properties directly linked to the Follings. However, given their extensive travels and Howard's business dealings across multiple states, it's possible, perhaps even likely, that there are other vessels whose remains are still undiscovered. I've made peace with the fact that we'll never know the full extent of the Follings crimes, Cooper says. But I haven't made peace with the fact that there are parents out there who still don't know what happened to their children. That's why I keep going back to the case files even in retirement. That's why I still follow up on every lead, no matter how unlikely, because those children deserve to have their names. They deserve to have their stories told. And so the macabre history of the Follings continues to unfold even decades after their crimes were first uncovered. It serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the facade of respectability of the vulnerable children who slip through the cracks of society, and of the terrible consequences when those entrusted with their care betray that sacred responsibility. Born Margaret Phelps in 1945, she grew up in a small farming community in rural Minnesota. Her parents were described by neighbors as deeply religious but private people who rarely attended community events and kept their children home from school whenever possible. Rumors swirled in the town about unusual religious practices in the Phelps household. Nothing specific, nothing that anyone could prove, says Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who studied the case but enough to make the family something of an enigma. The few people still living who remember the Phelps family describe them as odd and secretive. At 18, Margaret left home to attend nursing school in Minneapolis, which caused a permanent rift with her family. According to school records, she never returned home for holidays, and no family members attended her graduation. Margaret was a dedicated student who specialized in pediatric care, drawn to working with children from the start of her career. There is a gap in our understanding of Margaret's life between her graduation in 1965 and her marriage to Howard in 1976. Montgomery notes, "We know she worked at several hospitals across the Midwest, but never stayed in one place for more than a year or two. She also spent some time in Europe in the early 1970s, though the purpose of that trip remains unclear." It was during this European sojourn that Margaret might have encountered obscure religious texts that later influenced her beliefs. Among her possessions seized during the investigation was a collection of manuscripts, some dating back to the 17th century, focused on esoteric traditions like alchemy, Gnosticism, and mystical practices involving spiritual transference. The idea that qualities like sin or virtue could be moved from one vessel to another. These weren't mainstream religious texts. They were obscure, often fragmentary works that would have been difficult for a casual reader to find, Montgomery explains. Margaret must have sought them out deliberately, suggesting a pre-existing interest in these concepts. By the time Margaret met Howard Falling at a charity gala in Pittsburgh in 1975, she had already developed the framework of her belief system, a system she initially kept hidden from her future husband. Howard, by all accounts, was not a religious man. His interests centered on wealth and social status goals he pursued with single-minded determination. Whether Howard ever fully understood or shared Margaret's beliefs remains an open question. According to his testimony, he believed Margaret's interest in adoption stemmed from her genuine desire to help underprivileged children, coupled with her inability to have biological children. He claimed he only became aware of the religious aspect gradually, by which time he was too involved to extricate himself. Cooper, however, remained skeptical. Howard was an intelligent, observant man. The idea that he could live in that house for 15 years and not know what was happening, it's a stretch. It doesn't add up. Dr. Montgomery offers another perspective. I think Howard might have seen Margaret's beliefs as a form of eccentricity, something to be humored rather than challenged. There's evidence he was genuinely in love with her, at least initially. People in love often overlook or rationalize behaviors that would alarm an outsider. However, whatever Howard's level of understanding, there's no doubt that he enabled Margaret's actions through his financial resources and social connections. Without Howard's money to facilitate quick adoptions and buy properties where the vessels could be hidden or buried without suspicion, and without his status to deflect scrutiny, Margaret's mission may have been discovered much sooner. They were a perfect storm, Cooper says grimly. Margaret with her twisted vision, and Howard with the means to make it a reality. Caught in the middle of this was the tragic fate of 25 children, 12 officially adopted children, and 13 vessels. The adopted children were subjected to years of psychological and physical abuse, while the vessels endured extreme neglect before ultimately being killed when Margaret deemed them filled with the sins she believed she had extracted from the adopted children. Of the 12 adopted children, only 9 are alive today. In addition to James's suicide and Thomas's disappearance, Catherine died from a drug overdose in 2007 at the age of 28. The surviving 9 children have largely avoided public attention, changing their names and attempting to rebuild lives outside the shadow of their traumatic childhoods. Elizabeth, now in her 40s, is the only one who has spoken publicly about her experiences. In a rare interview with a documentary filmmaker in 2015, Elizabeth described the constant fear that permeated the Follings household. "We were always afraid of disappointing them. Sir and Madam, that's what we had to call them. They had these elaborate rules that changed all the time. You never knew what might trigger a punishment. Something that was acceptable one day could be forbidden the next. It kept us constantly on edge, constantly vigilant." Elizabeth also spoke about the cleansing rituals Margaret performed on the children. "She'd make us drink this tea that tasted horrible, and then she'd make us kneel in this circle she'd drawn on the floor. She'd recite these long passages in a language none of us understood, and touch our foreheads with this cold, wet finger. Sometimes she'd make cuts on our arms, small ones, nothing that would leave obvious scars, and collect the blood in a little silver cup. According to Elizabeth, the children were told these rituals were necessary to remove the badness they had brought with them from their previous lives. Madame said we were born with sin inside us like a disease. She said our birth parents had infected us and only she could cure us. If we resisted, she said the sin would grow until it consumed us, and we'd have to go live upstairs with the bad children. The bad children. Margaret's vessels were occasionally shown to the adopted children as a warning. She'd take us up there one at a time and make us look at them through this little window in the door, Elizabeth recalls. They were always so thin, so dirty, and their eyes, they looked dead already, you know, like there was nothing inside them anymore. Madame would say, "This is what happens to children who don't accept the treatment. This is what happens when the sin takes over." This psychological torture, combined with physical deprivation and isolation, created an environment of total control. The children were entirely dependent on Margaret and Howard for everything: food, shelter, human contact, and even the definition of reality itself. It was a classic cult dynamic, says Dr. Marrow. The leader defines what is true and false, good and evil. The followers are cut off from any outside influence that might contradict this definition. And over time, the followers internalize the leader's worldview to such an extent that they can no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the thoughts that have been implanted. Even after being removed from the Follings home, many of the children continued to defend their adoptive parents and insist that they had been happy there. Dr. Marrow clarifies, "It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome in the classical sense, it was more fundamental than that. These children had never known any other reality. They had no framework for understanding that what had happened to them was abuse. The process of healing for these children has been slow and painful. Some, like James, never managed to overcome the trauma. Others, like Elizabeth, have spent their lives in a cycle of progress and relapse, forever struggling with the psychological wounds inflicted during their formative years." The tragedy of the Follings case isn't just the 13 children who died, Dr. Marrow says. It's also the 12 who lived but were never allowed to develop into the people they might have been. Their potential was stolen from them just as surely as the lives of the vessels were stolen. In the years following the case, researchers have identified similar patterns in other cases of extreme child abuse, especially those with religious or cult-like elements. The combination of isolation, ritualistic behavior, and exploitation of children's natural dependency creates conditions in which unimaginable cruelty can thrive. What makes the Follings case unique, says Montgomery, is the scale and duration of the abuse, as well as the way it was hidden in plain sight. This wasn't a compound in the wilderness or a closed religious community. This was a respected family in a typical American town. The Follings went to church on Sundays. They attended community events. Howard served on local boards. They were to all outward appearances pillars of the community. This facade of normalcy allowed the Follings to operate for nearly 2 decades without serious scrutiny. When concerns were raised by Dr. Chen after Thomas's injury by Susan Fletcher after observing the family, these were too easily dismissed by those with the power to intervene. That's the lesson we should take from this case, Cooper insists. Not just the spectacular horror of what happened inside that house, but the ordinary failures that allowed it to continue. The neighbor who saw something odd but didn't speak up. The official who accepted a flimsy explanation because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The colleague who noticed something wrong but didn't want to risk their career by speaking up. These everyday failures of courage and responsibility, Cooper argues, multiplied across a community over many years, creating the conditions for the Follings crimes to flourish. And according to Cooper, similar dynamics continue to enable child abuse today. The names and circumstances change, but the pattern remains the same, he says. Someone notices something wrong, but they tell themselves it's not their business. Or they report it, but they don't follow up when nothing seems to happen. Or the system gets involved, but it's too overworked and underfunded to provide the kind of sustained attention that might reveal the truth. The Follings case highlights a systemic failure, particularly regarding children from marginalized communities. The very children the Follings targeted, poor immigrant children of color, and those in foster care, were more vulnerable to abuse and less likely to receive adequate protection. Cooper warns that the Follings case is a reminder of the dangers when we fail to protect our most vulnerable children. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed, but the respected neighbor down the street. Margaret Follings spent her final 13 years in a secure psychiatric facility, never tried for her crimes due to mental incompetence. She continued her rituals believing she was doing God's work. Howard in prison wrote a memoir portraying himself as a victim of Margaret's manipulation, though Cooper dismisses this as self-serving nonsense. Howard enabled the abuse and exploitation of 25 children, regardless of his beliefs. The Follings case serves as a critical study in how abuse can be hidden behind wealth and status, and how vulnerable children can slip through the cracks. Though tragic, the case has led to changes in laws and procedures, making us more vigilant and willing to ask tough questions to protect children. In the community garden where the Follings house once stood, 25 trees were planted to honor the victims. Each year they grow taller, a silent testimony to resilience and hope. The courage of those who spoke out, like Susan Fletcher and Maria Vasquez, and the courage of the children who survived, will always be remembered. This is a story of horror, but also one of courage. We must honor that courage with vigilance, ensuring such horrors are never again hidden behind respectability. May we remember those who didn't survive and continue to protect children everywhere. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.